All right. Well, let's begin our discussion of the trombone slow etude for Year D, the Andante con moto by Vladislav Blazhevich. Blazhevich was a great Russian trombonist and educator of the first half of the 20th century. He gave us a number of very fine performance and instructional pieces, of which this etude is one. It lies very well on the instrument. It's very well suited for the trombone. But that does bring me to my first point, which is to make sure that you're working on the correct etude, since trombone has a different etude, at least a different slow etude, than the euphonium and tuba players have for this set. Now let's define our terms. Andante con moto is a relatively slow walking tempo, but still with a sense of movement. And then we have dolce, which is sweetly. That's a little bit difficult word to explain what sweet means in practice, and yet most people don't have a hard time figuring out, at least in terms of sound, what it means to sound sweet as opposed to sounding, hard or bright or harsh. And then our tempo. The instructions indicate that this etude should be played with a quarter note at 88 to 96 beats per minute. I tend to favor the slow end of this tempo range, if not just a bit slower. And in any case, this piece sounds best with a bit of push and pull. So there are times when the tempo will push a little bit faster on the front ends of phrases, and then the ends of phrases especially might pull back even a little bit more than 88. Now, related to tempo is the concept of subdivision, or thinking the eighth note pulse. And that's vitally important, maybe even more so in slow pieces than in fast ones. And even though you will hopefully have some variation in tempo for expressive effect, subdivision adds an element of consistency of rhythm and time, one that helps to ensure that your expressiveness doesn't begin to sound like wrong rhythms. Simply slow down and speed up the subdivisions in your head as needed while you're playing. Practice this by actually playing the piece subdivided into eighth notes, and then transition to just thinking those subdivisions in your head and manipulating them as you play. Number 5, plan and mark your breaths. The breathing is relatively straightforward in this etude, and you can breathe at just about any place where the slur markings stop. And there are enough of these places that you shouldn't need to break up a written phrase. Again, Blazhevich was a trombonist. He knew how to write for us. Planning ahead and marking the places in the score where you will breathe promotes consistent phrasing, correct breathing, and even helps to fight off the effects of nervousness, which can sometimes cause hurried or shallow breaths. If you are accustomed to breathing deeply in the same places every time, you will likely keep doing so in the audition room despite any anxiety that you might feel. Marking breaths also helps you to avoid the problem of skipping a good breathing place because you don't feel like you're out of air, and yet running out of air before the next good place. If you have penciled in a breath, it will remind you that you need a breath in that spot, even if you don't feel like you need it in the moment. Now, legato articulations. We have a lot of legato in this etude, and those articulations require constant airflow. Most method books teach trombonists to execute legato articulations by tonguing softly. Now, while legato often, even usually, though not always, demands a soft tonguing technique, the most important thing in executing legato is that you blow a constant airstream through the passage, as this is what causes the end of one note to be connected to the beginning of the next note. This constant blowing, constant buzz, and constant sound, therefore, requires a quick and well-coordinated slide action in order to have the best effect, since moving the slide slowly or out of sync with the tongue will lead to unwanted smearing. Number 7, observe the dynamics, both the written dynamic markings and also just sort of the tendencies that you may sense that the etude needs to get louder or softer in a spot, even where it might not be explicitly marked. What you want to do is find a way that makes the musical lines lead to and from the most musically important notes. Happily, what this means is that you're going to be able to play a little bit louder on the highest notes, which will help you to play them a little more easily. And by the way, that metric push and pull that I mentioned a moment ago, where you kind of speed up the front ends of phrases a little bit and slow down the back ends of phrases, the dynamics follow pretty much along those same lines. It'll get a little faster and a little louder as the phrases build to a climactic moment, and then it will get a little bit slower and a little bit softer as it moves to a conclusion. Number 8, don't overemphasize the grace notes. Grace notes are ornaments. They're little musical decorations that are not nearly as important as the notes around them. That's why they're so small. If they were important, they would be big. Trombonists sometimes have a habit of overemphasizing ornaments, when in fact they should hardly be noticed. Play them correctly and quickly, but don't lean into them. Number 9, thoroughly familiarize yourself with the key of G major. There are lots of ways that you can do this besides just practicing your G major scale, which you're practicing along with all your scales. But you could do things like Arbin scale studies. There are some scale routines on my website, olemiss.edu/lowbrass, that you can use. And any etudes and pieces in the key of G. Just find a way to familiarize yourself with playing in this key of 1 sharp. And then, in addition to all of that, go ahead and pencil in the F sharps as needed. Nobody's going to look and see if you wrote them in, but they are going to notice if you don't play them. Finally, let's talk about the final cadence. It's okay if the conclusion of the marked portion of this etude kind of bothers you. The cut indicated in your instructions makes this etude a more reasonable length for our audition purposes, but it causes the etude to end on what is called a half cadence, where there's a dominant chord that's implied, and that should lead to the tonic chord that's implied in the next measure. If you think this etude ending where it does leaves you with an unsettled and incomplete feeling, well, take heart. It means you're normal. It means you've got good musical sense.